Good morning, everybody. I'm Anthony Buckley, and it's my privilege to be here at St Michael's and to welcome another great OCSG event. Welcome to those who are joining us at home. We're at a slightly different camera angle today because we have hardwired us in to the internet, so the streaming should be seamless. We are all very welcome, and especially to Carys, who is kindly joining us from Kettering today. Carys, who's had and has a wonderful ministry in helping people think about their faith, their journey of faith, including discernment, a psychotherapist, priest, and jolly good person. And I only met her 5 minutes ago, so there we go. It's all good. Yesterday I was standing outside at the end of our midday service, and I was wearing my robes, just was saying goodbye to someone. And someone from Cornmarket, the street out there, just called over the railings and said, "Father, Merry Christmas." And I said, "Merry Christmas." I then thought, we're still in November. But it still seemed somehow the right thing to say. But of course, before Christmas, we have Advent. And to have today to prepare us for that great and important season of Advent, just to take time apart, time away, to reflect, to listen, to pray, and to think. So welcome to our Advent Retreat Day, led by Carys. As you will have seen on the timetable, I think most of us have had, we've gone slightly flexible and changed things here or there, and we'll keep people in touch as the day goes on. But each one of us will have space to reflect and to pray. Each one of us will have space to listen and to engage. And those who are watching, joining us at home, we hope that the timetable which I've put in the stream details, I hope that will guide us through the day. But listen at the end of each session for any announcements in case we're changing the timings. Talking of which, last thing from me on this, some of you have asked, can we watch this again afterwards through our internet link? And yes, we can, very much. St Michael's uses YouTube on that, and we have a YouTube channel, and everything is then there forever and ever. But through the day, I'll try and write something down which may be more helpful. But it is, we can watch it any time, as often as we like. I'm going to say a prayer and then to hand over to Carys. Almighty God, we thank you for the great seasons of the church year, and how in each one you seek to speak to us and to draw us closer to Christ. We pray for one another as we prepare for Advent, and we prepare for this day. We pray for this day and for your blessing upon it. Amen. Over to Carys.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. If you can't hear me at the back, can you give a wave? I've been asked to project a little bit. I'm aware that this is to pick up for the folk at home, so if I'm a bit too quiet for people in church, please do say, and I will raise my voice in a good way. There are two handouts for today, so a little bit of housekeeping first. I think you might have been given one or two. The reason there are two is that all the poetry that we're going to be using, which is by R.S. Thomas, is still in copyright. So if you have a handout with all the R.S. Thomas poetry on, please, we ask you to leave it here because of copyright reasons. All the poetry by Hopkins is well out of copyright. And I think those folk at home have a version of the handout which has got the links online to the Hopkins poetry, so you can access it. So I hope that will work okay for you.
Can you possibly go a bit louder?
A bit louder.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah, but I don't want to use British voice.
Okay.
I'm just going to swap microphones. This happens in all the best retreat days.
And while that's happening, I'm just going to get my tea. wait for just a minute. How's that? Is that any better?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, just to echo the welcome already to this day today, we are almost in Advent. Tomorrow we enter Advent, and I have to say it's one of my favourite seasons in the year because it is so rich and so anticipatory, and I often find that it's some of the great poets who help me and guide me through crucial stages in the church's life, and who write so beautifully about what it means to wait, and to wait in hope, and at Advent to wait in hope for Christ. And so as we walk through the day today, and you'll have seen the timetable for this day, we're going to be doing this in the company of two of my particular favourite poets, who are R.S. Thomas and Gerard Manley Hopkins. And I have unashamedly chosen two poets whom I love and in whose company I've spent some considerable time. Thomas for decades, and Hopkins only for the last few years. But both I found have deepened my faith, have changed my faith, and have been a little bit of a mirror for me. And so I hope that as we reflect together, they may also ring bells for you, resonate just a little bit for you in their own ways. Both of them have been regarded as Welsh poets, probably one more justifiably than the other, as R.S. Thomas was such a dyed-in-the-wool Welshman, and with a particular affinity for North Wales, and Hopkins by association. He discovered his poetic muse burst back into life during his time at St Binos, which of course is the great Jesuit training centre, as was now wonderful retreat centre. So one an Anglican priest, one a Roman Catholic priest. And we're going to use their poems and allow them to nudge us a little bit, to shape us. There will be space as the day goes on. I'll try not to say too much, go over the time. I can get a bit carried away because I love the poetry, but I'm going to stick to the time because it's quite dense, some of this stuff. So we need some space, some air around it, so there'll be plenty of time to rest and relax with it. So let's begin talking about waiting. And we're going to start in this first session with the poetry of R.S. Thomas. We'll certainly use two poems. We may touch on a third, which is slightly different. And I'm going to assume at this point minimal knowledge of the two poets, just in case we are a mix of people who know loads about the poets and people who know virtually nothing about the poets. So just a little pen picture about R.S. Thomas. He died only in the year 2000. He'd been born in 1913, and he lived the whole of his life on a very small canvas, mostly in Wales. He was a parish priest. He was an incumbent in three significant parish areas. He had previously been a curate on the Welsh marches. And he'd been writing poetry for years. He wrote it throughout his life virtually. And his view of poetry was that it was a religious activity, that all engagement with the arts is essentially religious. And that's because he saw it as essentially creative, and so an echo of the primary creative urge in the universe, which comes, of course, from God. So he saw all creative activity as religious activity, which didn't mean that all his poetry was religious, but it became increasingly so as the years went by. Thomas went through quite a big change in how he wrote poetry. Some years into his ministry, and as a middle-aged man, he started to go through some significant changes. He'd written a lot about Wales and Welsh. He was very antagonistic to those whom he considered to be the overlords of the Welsh, that is, those who'd come from England as interlopers into Wales, and he could be quite sharp, shall we say, about folk. He himself learnt Welsh as an adult, and it was only later in life that he was able to preach in Welsh and minister in Welsh, but he was never able to write poetry in Welsh. Seeing as I have Welsh roots, but seeing as my Welsh is minimal, I have to say that's a relief to me. He wrote in English all the way through his poetic life, and there was this transition time in his poetry, which took place, as I said, in his middle years, and this was in the 1960s. And some of this was around God and how he wrote and spoke about God, and some of it was around how he understood what it means to wait. So something happened within him, and it seems to have been related to moving to a new parish and having the sense that the muse which had inspired him in his previous parish had kind of disappeared a bit. He didn't know quite what to write about. He'd written about the Welsh hill farmers. He'd written about their courage. He'd written about his relationships with them. And suddenly he found himself in a parish which was mostly occupied by retired folk. Lots of them were from England. There were lots of military people there, some senior military there, and he found that he was uninspired. So what happened was, he went inwards, and he started to interrogate his interior life and invite God inside, rather than write about everything he could see going on around him on the outside. And this seems to be when some of the changes started happening, and his relationship with waiting started to change. So we're now going to start with the first poem on the subject of waiting. And this is the first, I think, on your handout, and it's called In Church. And it was written by R.S. Thomas in the early 1960s, before his move to his last incumbency. I'll read it once, and then I'll have a break, and then I'll read it again. None of his poetry is incredibly long. Often I try to analyse the quality of its silences. Is this where God hides from my searching? I have stopped to listen after the few people have gone to the air recomposing itself for vigil. It has waited like this since the stones grouped themselves about it. These are the hard ribs of a body that our prayers have failed to animate. Shadows advance from their corners to take possession of places in the light held for an hour. The bats resume their business. The uneasiness of the pews ceases. There is no other sound in the darkness but the sound of a man breathing, testing his faith on emptiness, nailing his questions one by one to an untenanted cross. I'm going to read it again, and I'm going to invite us all to imagine that we are here by ourselves in this ancient place of worship, and that everyone's gone, and feel the experience of being here in a kind of a silent space. Often I try to analyse the quality of its silences. Is this where God hides from my searching? I have stopped to listen after the few people have gone to the air recomposing itself for vigil. It has waited like this since the stones grouped themselves about it. These are the hard ribs of a body that our prayers have failed to animate. Shadows advance from their corners to take possession of places the light held for an hour. The bats resume their business. The uneasiness of the pews ceases. There is no other sound in the darkness but the sound of a man breathing, testing his faith on emptiness, nailing his questions one by one to an untenanted cross. This poem about waiting, from, as I said, the early 60s, is a fascinating glimpse into Thomas's experience of sitting in church and waiting at this time in his life. And there's something about the waiting which is very much focused on, if you like, this is my experience. I wonder where God is. I wonder what all the noises mean. And there's a lot of, almost a lot of activity in it, really. So just to have a look at it briefly, he's in church, waiting, and he's analysing the silence going on around him. He's quite busy on the inside. Is God hiding from me? I'm waiting, and there's nothing coming back. Where is God? He says he stops to listen after the few people have gone. So the place is now empty, apart from him, but also the other characters who are present. And in this case, the other characters are the air, because the air is steadying itself. The air is, as he says, recomposing itself for vigil. It's as if the air in the church feels it's been interrupted by everybody being in there. And now the air itself is settling and ready to wait. The air is preparing for its own vigil. And he says the air has waited like this. The air has waited since the stones grouped themselves about it, which I think is an extraordinary image of the air being the main character. The stones have gathered around. It's not like it's been built, it's that the stones are gathering around the air, almost to participate in the sense of the air waiting in its own vigil. These are the hard ribs, that's the stone constructions of a body that our prayers have failed to animate. Now this is curious, and typically for Thomas, it could mean a whole load of things, and so often with his poetry and Hopkins later on, some of this is very impressionistic, and we might find that we have our own responses to it. So when we hear that these are the hard ribs of a body that our prayers have failed to animate, it could be that what comes to us is the sense of the stone surround, holding in place this space, this air, which for whatever reason, all our prayers poured into it for centuries have resisted. So what is going on? What's the air up to in this place of waiting? Or it could be some strange reference to himself or to us, how we pray and we breathe and we wait. But there are times when we seem so consumed by the silence and the waiting that somehow we don't feel animated by prayer. And that can be true of us at any time, that prayer may be a source of struggle. More characters, shadows, advance from their corners. to take possession of places the light held for an hour. So everybody's gone now. The lights are off. It could be the light outside is fading and the shadows creep forward because the light no longer holds sway in this place. More characters, saints and witnesses perhaps. And then more characters. The bats resume their business. The bats can get on with whatever bats do when there's nobody else around. And even the pews seem to have their own character here. The uneasiness of the pews ceases. That could be the uneasiness of people sitting in pews, shuffling about, coming and going. Or it could be the pews have been uneasy when people have been in there because it's their space and now it's time to reclaim it. And with all this going on, there is no other sound. There is no other sound in the darkness but the sound of a man breathing, testing his faith on emptiness. The poet, we assume, all he can hear is himself in this silent, waiting place, testing his faith in the emptiness, going back a bit to, is God hiding from my searching? He's testing his faith, nailing his questions one by one to an untenanted cross. This is a very, very familiar way for Thomas to see faith and question. He never shies from questioning. He never shies from testing things. A priest all his adult life, he never shied from asking tough questions about faith. And the untenanted cross, people have different responses to this. For some, the cross is untenanted because Jesus has risen and is no longer on it. For others, the cross is untenanted because in this silent place where Thomas seems to be struggling to find God, it is just another picture of his searching. This is one example of Thomas and waiting. It's a well-known poem, but not one of the most well-known poems. And we're going to move on to one of the most well-known poems of waiting in just a minute. A few years after he left the parish where he wrote this, he moved to his last incumbency, his last role as a vicar before retiring. And this was in Aberdaron in North Wales. And for those who are not that familiar with the geography of North Wales, if you imagine North Wales with its arms sticking out the Llŷn Peninsula, which goes all the way down to the sea with Anglesey just over it, Aberdaron is the furthest most western tip of that peninsula, right at the very, very end. And this was a significant place for Thomas, because whilst he was absolutely a Welshman, he had never felt that he could take his Welsh identity in properly. He had felt very influenced by the part of his family which had been sort of aspirationally English, and there had been a part of his family on his mother's side like that, whereas his father's side was very North Walian, very culturally North Walian, and he'd struggled to take that bit of himself in. And he'd always been casting around for a parish where he could feel himself to be most Welsh. And this came at Aberdaron. And it was here that he ministered in Welsh, he preached in Welsh, he did all his pastoral visits in Welsh. And so he said he felt that one aspect of his personal quest had ceased. He didn't need to worry anymore about how Welsh he was, because he could feel it in his bones. And this was the point, he said, when his focus changed in poetry. And whilst he'd already been moving into a more interior place, it was here in Aberdaron that he focused all his attention on God, on writing about God, on the religious, on his experience of God present and absent. And at this point, amongst many other glorious poems of his written whilst he was in Aberdaron and afterwards. He wrote one of his most famous poems about waiting, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with. It's called Kneeling, and I'll read it again in a moment. The second poem on your sheet is called Evening, and if we've got time before the end of this first talk, we'll have a little look at that. But just over the page, you'll find the poem Kneeling, which is very short. And this was written whilst kneeling in one of the two churches in the parish of Aberdaron. It's a little church called St Maelrys, which is no longer, sadly, a place of worship. And here, well, I'll read the poem, and then I'll stop and then I'll read it again, and have a reflect as I read it. And see for you what's different and what's similar from the first poem of waiting. Kneeling. This one was published, I think, in 1968. Moments of great calm. Kneeling before an altar of wood in a stone church in summer. Waiting for the God to speak. The air a staircase for silence. The sun's light ringing me as though I acted a great role. And the audience is still. All that close throng of spirits waiting as I for the message. Prompt me, God, but not yet. When I speak, though it be you who speak through me, something is lost. The meaning is in the waiting. Let's let that seep in again for a bit. I'll read it again. Moments of great calm, kneeling before an altar of wood in a stone church in summer. Waiting for the God to speak. The air a staircase for silence, the sun's light ringing me as though I acted a great role. And the audience is still. All that close throng of spirits waiting as I for the message. Prompt me, God, but not yet. When I speak, though it be you who speak through me, something is lost. The meaning is in the waiting. There's a slightly different mood in this poem. For me, it's a poem of the most extraordinary simplicity, but also incredible depth. It's speaking to us about God come amongst us in our waiting. God filling the spaces around us and somehow quickening the silences. For me, the difference between this and his slightly earlier poem about waiting is that he's in it. It doesn't feel as if he's casting around wondering what everybody's up to, but he and whatever else is in this place of waiting are doing this together. I'll say a little bit more, just go through it a bit. As often happens with Thomas, he starts the poem as if he's in the middle of a sentence. So he starts, moments of great calm. There's no more specific entry into it, and he did that a lot, and it's almost like we catch him in the middle of a conversation. There's another poem of his which begins, why no? as if he's responding to something somebody else has said. So we get the sense of a constant poetic engagement. It's a bit like walking into a service in an Orthodox church, in the middle of it, and the worship's going on, whether you're there or not. It has that quality to it. We enter his thought process. Moments of great calm. So these are individual moments, but also there's a sequence. These are droplets of time in a sea of time. Kneeling before an altar of wood in a stone church. That has a very interesting feel to it. To me, it's kneeling before an altar of wood in a stone church in summer, waiting for the God to speak. It has almost an ancient feel to it. There's something almost pre-Christian about it, this sense of stone, wood, the God. That's very Thomas language again. And it's as if we are somehow playing with now and always. And in that sense, there's something very Advent about it. There is these moments, it's the now and not yet sense of being in God's presence. Moments in this solid, ancient place of worship. Waiting for the God to speak. This isn't him saying, is this God where God hides from my silences? He's saying, waiting for the one who is here to speak. The air, a staircase for silence. That feel of Jacob's ladder, that feel of God's messengers coming and going through the air, in the staircase for silence. And you can have that picture, if you like, in a church in summer with light coming through the windows. I'm sure many of us know what that looks and feels like, where you get these motes of light pouring through the windows in the summer in church. And that sense of light and movement, that there is the staircase of the coming and going of God's messengers and God's messages. So we get that movement as well. And then, I think it's the 5th and 6th lines down, he does something really interesting. He puts speak above silence. Poetically, there are never any mistakes in his poems, so to put speak above silence is an interesting conflation of these two. There is speech he's hoping for, but there is silence too, so how do we manage this? And he is filled with the sun's light. I find the next bit interesting. It's almost as if he's slightly making fun of himself, as if I acted a great role. He's in a kind of the spotlight is on him, as if I acted a great role, as a kind of as if quality to it. And the audience is still. So we don't have the busyness of the bats. We don't have shadows emerging from corners. We don't have the pews uneasily creaking or settling. Everybody there, all presence in that place is still, as if everything and everyone is waiting for the message. And then we have that wonderful break in the poem. Prompt me, God, but not yet. Of course, here he's given us some echoes of St. Augustine, who said, save me, but not yet, or make me pure, but not yet. In this case, the poet says, prompt me, God, but not yet. It's a way of saying, please speak to me, but no, not yet. And he says, when I speak, though it be you who speak through me, God, addressing God, something is lost. So he knows that as soon as the presence of God reaches him and gives him the words to speak or the words to think, He knows that even though this is from God, he can't help but slightly dilute it because he becomes the mediator of God's presence. Though it be you who speak through me, something is lost. And then this great line. The meaning is in the waiting. That takes us back to, prompt me, God, but not yet. Please don't fill the silence yet. Let me wait for longer, please. Because it's as I wait that I draw close to you, is what to me he's saying. The meaning is in the waiting, which feels the heart of Advent. We know that Advent has become a place which we are encouraged to rush through on the heady journey towards Christmas. And it's often very difficult to find that place of meaning within it. It's a season for a reason. We are invited to spend this time in waiting, such that when Christmas does come, perhaps the meaning of God with us has been transformed by the experience of waiting and allowing this richness of waiting to break upon us, to break through into us. A few years after, some years after actually, Thomas wrote a very curious sort of poetry, prose, autobiographical piece. He wrote a couple of autobiographical things. But there's something called The Echoes Return Slow, which is something he wrote, which was a mix of prose and poetry. And he just has a one-liner in part of that. And he said this: you have to imagine a waiting that is not impatient, because it is timeless. You have to imagine a waiting that is not impatient, because it is timeless. In the dying moments of this first session, we briefly turn our attention, very briefly, to the second poem on your handout, which is called Evening. And this is purely added because it has this timeless quality to it. Very, very brief poem, which I'll read twice. The archer with time as his arrow, has he broken his strings that the rainbow is so quiet over our village? Let us stand there in the interval of our wounding, till the silence turn golden and love is a moment eternally overflowing. The archer with time as his arrow, has he broken his strings that the rainbow is so quiet over our village? Let us stand then, in the interval of our wounding, till the silence turn golden and love is a moment eternally overflowing. This tiny poem, with two very distinct bits to it, can invite us into this moment of timelessness. He starts with that picture of the archer with an arrow which is time, so shooting it into the air. But then he says, has this archer broken his strings that the rainbow is so quiet over our village? We're in a moment of quiet. It's as if time stops. And then in this beautiful, brief phrase, let us stand then. Let us. It's an invitation. It's as if we're invited to be with him. Let us stand then, in the interval of our wounding. We're in this moment out of time, this space, this timelessness. And the interval of our wounding is a puzzling phrase. We might have very different responses to what it means. For me, I wonder if it's the interval of our wounding is the nature of being alive and being human. This is an interval in eternity. We eternal creatures of God. In this particular interval, in our humanity, life is mixed. There are hurts, there are wounds, and it is an interval, because beyond this time, beyond this moment, we reach into eternity. Let us stand then in the interval of our wounding till the silence turn golden. And love is a moment eternally overflowing. Sorry, I get a bit choked reading his poetry. I'll try not to. This, for me, feels like the epitome of you have to imagine a waiting that is not impatient because it is timeless. And so let us begin Advent with this sense of waiting, or whatever we've taken from Thomas's poetry of waiting. And may we discover the quality of waiting in Advent, which is most enriching for us. I'm going to stop now, and we can have our break and return at 11:30.
Thank you, Carys, so very, very much. So much to reflect upon. You are very welcome in the half an hour we have now, just to sit or scatter around the church building if you wish and find your own space, to have another cup of coffee and tea in the parish room if you wish, or if fresh air seems good, just to wander out and maybe as we see the rush and the crowds out there, be contrasting that with the sense, the call to find meaning in our own waiting. However you wish to spend the next half an hour, bless you on that, and likewise those at home, and we will regather at 11:30.